Welcome and thank you for joining us for the first installment in the new Beta International Study Center BISC Mini Lecture Series, designed especially for CASA alumni and friends. In a few moments, we'll be hearing from Dr. Lloyd, who will be answering your questions live from the Castle Ballroom, a location that we hope will bring back some positive memories for many of you. First, though, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on traditional Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. Today, I ask you to imagine what Queen's main campus and its affiliated BISC campus may have looked like hundreds of years ago. I want you to take away the buildings, the roads, the stoplights. I want you to think about the people that have walked this land before us, that have worked this land, and those that have protected this land. And I want you to thank them. I want you to remember those that were displaced from this land, those that were physically and violently removed from this land, and those that laid down their lives trying to stay on this land. And I want you to remember them. I ask you to join me in tapping into your own histories and positionalities, whether you sustain and live off of this land today as a native, a settler, an immigrant, a refugee, or a visitor. I ask that you reflect on what that means. How we call this place home, yet we've invaded the home of others. I invite you to reflect on how your privilege allows for you to benefit from the colonial structures in place while continuously keeping Indigenous communities marginalized and oppressed. I use this land acknowledgement as a call to action, one in which I ask you to keep in mind that this isn't just history. Indigenous communities are still being displaced, mistreated, neglected as we speak, all while continuing to protect this land. This isn't history repeating itself. This is a colonial project that has never actually stopped. We owe it to our Indigenous brothers and sisters to listen, to learn, and most importantly, to respect. For those who don't know me, I'm Nirosha Balkumar, BISC 18, ArtSci 19, and I'm currently coming to you from my dorm room at the University of Cambridge while in quarantine. I just moved to the UK last week to start my master's in education, and I'm really excited to be here during these unprecedented times. I'm also a member of the recently convened BISC Volunteer Advisory Group, whose objective is to provide insights and perspectives to help shape CASA alumni engagement opportunities and events such as this. My fellow group members include Oliver Brands, BISC 95, Emily Burns, BISC 80, BISC 08, Kate D. Wolf, BISC 06, Tracy Marshall, BISC 97, and Camilo Montoya Guevara, BISC 10. If you have thoughts or questions you would like to share with the advisory group, please email to the BISC Alumni Relations Team at bisc.alumni@queensu.ca. I hope some of you were able to get into the spirit for today's lecture by mixing your own Purple Haze cocktail or mocktail. We also encourage you to post your best air guitar photos at Queen's BISC using the hashtag BISCMiniLecture. Finally, a few quick housekeeping items. Please note that we will be recording today's session and we'll make it available for you afterwards. There will be a time for questions at the end of Dr. Lloyd's talk, and we encourage you to share your comments and thoughts through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Some of you made the effort to submit questions in advance, and we thank you for that. And just a quick reminder that if you haven't already, please update your Zoom username with your name, CASL year, and program so we can easily identify and connect with each other in the chat box. I understand that we have some current students and parents joining us today. As well, we also encourage you to say hello in the chat. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Lloyd, BISC Academic Director. He was involved in the recreation of Jimi Hendrix Flat on Brook Street, Mayfair, and in 2016, his monograph, Hendrix at Home, A Bluesman in Mayfair, was published by Handel House. This book was followed by several public lectures at that site and elsewhere in the UK. Christian is currently working on a longer book about Hendrix, which delves into the circle of creatives in London who surrounded him, his manipulation of his public image, and his complex identity. It will also consider Hendrix as a literary figure and look at his lyrics, which have never been analyzed fully, despite the many books about him. Please welcome Dr. Lloyd.
Thanks to Nirosha and Duncan. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes and then I'll be happy to answer questions and discuss your responses. My thoughts today come from my work researching towards the recreation of Jimi Hendrix's flat in Brook Street, Mayfair in the West End of London. If you look at the image, it's on the left-hand side, and Hendrix occupied the two top floors of that building, which just happened to be next door to the house in which Handel lived for many years and wrote most of his important music. Hendrix moved to this flat on Brook Street in July 1968 and was really pleased about the connection with Handel. He felt it was meaningful. It's usually open to the public, so you can visit, but they haven't reopened since the COVID emergency started. That said, there is a good 360-degree tour on their website that you can access for free. As part of that project, I wrote a book called Hendrix at Home, A Bluesman in Mayfair, which is currently available via the Handel and Hendrix website and also Etsy. In that book, I tried to avoid constructing Hendrix the icon and rather to show his life at the flat in forensic detail to deal with his everyday life. I wanted to think about him as someone whose work and life was still in process and how he used the resources of London to become himself. This is a photograph of the recreation of the main room of Jimi Hendrix's flat where he lived with Kathy Etchingham, his girlfriend, and you can see the style is quite sumptuous in many ways. There are Indian fabrics and carpets, cushions from Portobello Road traders, and he actually bought the curtains from John Lewis just around the corner on Oxford Street. The music industry in the late 60s was very amateurish and disorganized by modern day standards, and so when Hendrix was doing press interviews in 1969 to launch his third album, Electric Ladyland, he actually invited many journalists basically into his bedroom to talk with them and be recorded. It also functioned as a living space, rehearsal studio, nightclub, general sort of 60s hangout. What comes to mind when we think of Jimi Hendrix? If you Google Hendrix Genius, you get about 500,000 hits. And why is that? Well, the answer in some ways is fairly obvious, that Hendrix was the greatest virtuoso instrumentalist in rock music. That's pretty indisputable. He was also a game changer with his use of distortion, feedback, signal processing, etc. He's a great lyricist, that's often underlooked. And he created a very unusual image by which to present his music, which really made him an emblem of the age. You can see how easily he's become an icon on t-shirts and posters and so on. To put it in shortly, he has an all-round abnormal musical intelligence. I always feel sorry for the other guitarists of his era, because it must have been like being an Elizabethan playwright when suddenly Shakespeare shows up. You can be really good, but you're not as good as him. So the idea of Hendrix as a genius is true. You can make a case for that. But I actually think thinking of Hendrix as a genius is a bad way of thinking about him, and it's even demeaning to the hard work he put in and the careful interplay with other musicians and creative people around him. If we believe the Oxford English Dictionary, genius is defined as exceptional creative power or an exceptionally talented or intelligent individual. Hendrix clearly fits those criteria. But the problem here is the word individual, the myth of the lone creator in whom talent is mysteriously present and inherent. What I want to show today is how the circle or scene around Jimi Hendrix in London made his work possible, how he relied deeply on so many brilliant light minds in music, fashion, engineering, retail, etc. I'm going to base my argument on Brian Eno's neologism, Scenius, a word he creates to replace the word genius. If you look on the slide, we have Eno's definition there. Eno says, Scenius stands for the intelligence and the intuition of a whole cultural scene. It is the communal form of the concept of the genius. Eno, who was, for example, one of David Bowie's most important collaborators, doesn't believe in solitary creation or effortless production of art. Instead, he feels from his own practice that great art is communal, collaborative, and effortful. It's hard work. So before we get on to Hendrix, let's look at two examples of Scenius from literature and music. I think the most obvious example of British Scenius is the Bloomsbury Group. So if you remember, this is the group which included Virginia Woolf, probably the greatest novelist of her day, Roger Fry, the greatest art history critic, Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist, and Lytton Strachey, the greatest biographer. They're all radical innovators in their fields, and they began to meet when they were in their late teens, early 20s in the Bloomsbury area of London to discuss work in progress. And they had an incredible synergy. They really fed off each other, even though they're working in different fields. They follow a pattern that often seems to generate Scenius, where there is a kind of initial transgression that opens up the workings of this scene. And I'm going to read you a quote from Virginia Woolf's memoir, which was written later but describes this inaugural moment. So you have the Bloomsbury Group sitting in Gordon Square in a room. Suddenly, the door opened and the long and sinister figure of Mr. Lytton Strachey stood on the threshold. He pointed his finger at a stain on Vanessa's white dress. "Seaman," he said. "Can one really say it?" I thought, and we burst out laughing. With that one word, all barriers of reticence and reserve went down. A flood of the sacred fluid seemed to overwhelm us. Sex permeated our conversation. The word bugger was never far from our lips. We discussed copulation with the same excitement and openness that we had discussed the nature of good. It is strange to think how reticent, how reserved we had been, and for how long. It seems a marvel now that so late as the year 1908, Clive had blushed, and I had blushed too, when I asked him to let me pass to go to the lavatory on the French express train. So you can see for the Bloomsbury Group, for Woolf in particular, one transgressive word, one opening up against propriety ends the Victorian era, at least for them. It frees their scene to produce in creative synergy in several fields. Let me give you another example, and this one is punk rock Scenius. So in 1976, the Sex Pistols appeared on a weekend television show which was hosted by a guy called Bill Grundy, who was a very cynical presenter who is known to have been often drunk on TV. The only reason they got on the show was because Queen had pulled out at the last minute, so they desperately searched around for some exciting new band. And the key moment of this interview, which you can see very readily on YouTube if you wish to, is when Bill Grundy, who is clearly drunk, as are the band, starts harassing one of their friends, Susie Sue, who was later in Susie and the Banshees. Steve Jones, the guitarist, then launches into him, calling him, "You dirty old man, you fucking rotter." And the show naturally winds up fairly quickly. Next day in the English papers, absolute outrage. People are terribly shocked by this. And if you think about it, Steve Jones is simply telling the truth on live TV. He's broken the conventions that you don't tell the truth on live TV. And for the band, at that point, they suddenly realised their own power, that the straight world, the normal world, the conventional world was frightened of them. They didn't need to be frightened of what other people thought of them, because they then went on to be tremendously successful. So those two examples show you Scenius in action, the one risk-taking moment it needs to bring it into being. It then begins to develop rapidly as the partners in the Scenius get excited by new possibilities. They can now begin to ignore external norms and hostility, and will begin to take risks in whatever they're creating. Let's look at the Scenius surrounding Jimi Hendrix. Let's introduce the four main players and look particularly closely at the clothes they're wearing in the image on the screen. So this is Roger Mayer standing on the left. So he invented many of Hendrix's effects pedals and came on the '68 tour of the US to make sure the sound was good. Next to him, second from the left, is Mitch Mitchell, the drummer. Notice his sunflower sort of smock thing and his hat. Then Hendrix, of course, holding a Super 8 camera, wearing a very striking jacket and shirt combo. And then on the right is Noel Redding, the bass player, wearing a fringe jacket. They're actually standing at a truck stop at Tempe, Arizona, driving on their way to the next gig. And as I put it, they're dressed to kill or to be killed. You can imagine the reaction in conservative parts of America when four people like this walked into the door. Jimi Hendrix's Scenius begins with his second single, Purple Haze, which was released in March 1967. You can see the poster advertising it for the US market on the right-hand side of the slide. This song codes drug experiences and narrative about a bewitching woman that the narrator is utterly obsessed with. It's a really remarkable recording with extreme signal processing, and most notable is the guitar solo Hendrix plays. Each note in the solo is doubled by a ghost note 1 octave up, and it becomes a very strange and eerie sound, incredibly ear-catching, and I'd say one of the weirdest records to that point that had actually managed to become a hit. The sound was so unprecedented that his English record company, Track Records, had to write "deliberate distortion, do not correct" on the tape box when they shipped the master to Reprise Records for the US pressing. I think they're worried that Reprise would start messing with the sound because they assumed there was a recording mistake on it. How did Jimi Hendrix make the sound on the guitar solo of Purple Haze? He used Roger Mayer's Octavia effects box. You can see an image of that on the slide and some of the circuitry as well. Roger Mayer, who, if you remember, was on the left-hand side at the truck stop in Arizona, was a childhood friend of Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck, and he ran into Hendrix by chance at the Speakeasy Club, where they formed a friendship based on their love of science fiction. He mentioned that he had made this new device, which Jimmy Page thought was too weird, and Hendrix was immediately interested in that. So he took it to a couple of Hendrix gigs, and Hendrix absolutely loved it. What the Octavia effects box does is it splits the signal that enters it and raises half the signal an octave, and then the two notes, the original note and the octave raised note, come out of the other end. So it sounds two notes more or less simultaneously. This effect is interpreted by different listeners in different ways. Some hear it as a kind of eerie whistle above the main note. Others conceive of it as the bass note flying upwards towards infinity. I think of it mainly as a kind of destabilization of the main note, making the expected seem weirdly malleable. And the whole lyric is organized around the phrase, "Lately things don't seem the same." It's a song about perception, so you have form following function here. This is Scenius in action. Mayer is interested in making unprecedented sounds. He's a very experimental engineer. Hendrix eggs him on. He wants new sounds to express his new experiences, his new lyrical concerns. And they both go making more and more extreme effects as he tries to create sonic analogues for the subject matter he's talking about, which is sometimes drugs, sometimes alienation. This is the moment of transgression that brings Jimi Hendrix's Scenius into being. Why did Mayer have this experimental mentality? The reason is, I think, that he was an employee of the Royal Navy working on underwater acoustics for anti-submarine purposes. Remember, of course, this is still the Cold War period. Mayer's boss in the Navy was an acolyte of Barnes Wallis, the inventor of the bouncing bomb, another weird piece of engineering. If you look on the slide, you can see how the bouncing bomb worked. Barnes Wallis realized that if they wanted to bomb a series of German dams which fed German industry, they couldn't fly a plane close enough to drop the bomb directly. There was too many flak guns and so on top of the dams. They had submarine and torpedo nets, so they couldn't launch an underwater attack. So he had to make a bomb that would actually skip along the surface of the water, much like a stone skips along the surface of the sea when you skim it. And the added bonus, I suppose you could say, is that when the spinning bomb hits the dam wall, it spins down and only explodes at the bottom, creating devastating damage. And as we know, the Dam Busters raid was a success, causing massive damage and, in fact, large loss of life as well. Hendrix, Mayer and Barnes Wallis all share the same mentality, to make it new, to do something that seems crazy or impossible. And I think this is a kind of intergenerational Scenius that Hendrix feeds off via Mayer. Eno is always keen to locate Scenius around place, but I think you can also have a kind of imagined community. In this case, Hendrix obviously never met Barnes Wallis, but he somehow, at one remove, feeds off his work. One more point about Purple Haze. The track was produced and edited by Chas Chandler, who you can see in the picture talking to Hendrix. Chandler had been the bass player of the Animals and had played on massive hits such as House of the Rising Sun, and he was now the co-manager of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Chandler is often seen as a sort of moderating or conservative figure, but I think this is totally wrong. Someone who knew Chandler and had been in the studio with him told me that his maxim there was, "The only rule is there is no rule." This is what Chandler tried to expound as a producer, and in this case, it's Chandler's editing of Hendrix's original track, and particularly a very long original lyric, by forcing Hendrix to reduce the track to under 3 minutes. He crams all of Hendrix's ideas into a small space, and it becomes an explosive listen. It reminds me a bit of Shakespeare's sonnets, where you have so much thought, so much wit, so much to think about in a very small space, and it's very, very powerful. So this is a case of editorial Scenius, another key figure in Hendrix's circle, who is helping him achieve what seems impossible. Here's a slightly more tenuous, but I think really interesting member of Hendrix's Scenius group, and it's the poet and painter William Blake. If you look at the plaque in the photograph, That's on the wall of South Molton Street that Hendrix walked down every day when he was walking into the West End of London to buy records or buy clothes or see friends. And we know he knew about Blake because you can see the original engraving of Jerusalem on the right-hand side. Hendrix borrows the phrase about the arrows of desire for his own song, Voodoo Child. So we know that Hendrix had read Blake. And the reason I include this is Peter Ackroyd's idea of London somehow retaining the influence of its previous citizens, in this case Blake. There's something about Hendrix's neighbourhood with Handel and Blake in it that I think helps his creativity, sort of inspires him to be very experimental. Blake in particular is a sort of neo-psychedelic figure and was very much revered during the 1960s. His most famous maxim, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. You can see how that goes along with Hendrix. So I think walking by that sign every day must have been inspirational to Hendrix. Fashion is also a large part of Jimi Hendrix's Scenius. Remember the jacket that Hendrix is wearing in the photograph taken in Arizona? It has a huge pattern on it, so it looks kind of odd. The scale of the print looks wrong for the size of the piece of clothing. And it's actually similar to the jacket George Harrison is wearing in the right-hand picture here. Hendrix and Harrison's jackets were made by a tailor called John Pierce, who, believe it or not, is still in business. He has a shop on Mead Street in Soho. I've met him. And one night, coming back from a party very early in the morning, he was coming back about 9 o'clock in the morning, he wandered drunkenly through Liberty, the great department store that's still there. And he noticed the William Morris upholstery fabric, which you can see in the left-hand image. Pierce was smart enough to think he'd get an interesting effect by using it for clothes, when of course it's intended for curtains or settees or something like that. And like Mayer's Octavia, Pierce is using it to create a kind of distortion effect. William Morris was a socialist and wanted to create the house beautiful for everyone. He's a kind of Victorian Democrat and an aesthete. But by the 1960s, his fabric designs just really signified tradition and respectable middle-class taste. So Pierce uses it in a deliberate category mistake. He's using material that's designed for curtains to make jackets for pop stars to mock that propriety. It's a very subversive choice of style. And it became very popular with pop stars. Several of the Beatles wore his clothes, the Rolling Stones, Hendrix, Eric Clapton, and so on. So what you have here is Scenius working parallel in different fields in fashion and music. You can see why Hendrix immediately latched on to Pierce's work. It would be easy to think that unconventional choices of fabrics for clothing are insignificant, but I think they actually signal a wider shift in worldview, a whole new politics of deliberate category mistakes that was deeply frightening to conventional people, especially the older generations. And I've just got a quote from Jenny Diskey's excellent book, The 60s. She says, "Record covers became art and art became tea towels. Things got mixed up in a way that was interesting and amusing to us. Our parents kept things separate and appropriate. They had that ancient terror of mixing things up, of losing the order of things." And you see Hendrix's quote that goes quite well with that. "I like shades of colour that clash." So Mayer, Pierce and Hendrix create a Scenius together where they inspire or goad each other on to ever greater transgressions of norms. It's not Pierce plus Mayer plus Hendrix. It's Pierce times Mayer times Hendrix. I'm now going to suggest an even more perhaps tenuous or experimental intergenerational Scenius to go with the Barnes Wallis and William Blake. That sense of London somehow retaining its past subversions and passing them on to subsequent generations. If you look at the jacket or smock that Mitch Mitchell is wearing with the sunflowers on it, that piece of clothing, I'm not sure who made it, it wasn't Pierce, I asked him, plays off Oscar Wilde's clothing which represented the 1890s aesthetic movement. The sunflower became the symbol of this art for art's sake movement, which rejected nature and rejected art as a vehicle for morality. And if you look on the right-hand images there, you can see a kind of caricature of Wilde as an aesthete, and then a rather effete-looking man again, both with sunflowers there, so you can see the dotted line from the Jimi Hendrix experience to the Oscar Wilde experience. Scenius is important to keep experimental creativity going, and that was very much true for Hendrix as it was for Wilde. And what it does is when you get a Scenius group working together, the kind of mockery it would get from at the outside, for example, people laughing at Hendrix and co because of the way they dressed at a truck stop, or people mocking Wilde, who at one stage had a suit made of green felt from a billiard table, you can just shut that off. The group doesn't really care about what outsiders think anymore. Wilde himself had many sort of psychedelic experiences, and there's a great memory he records where he's been drinking absinthe all evening in the Café Royal in London, and as he walks out over a floral carpet, he says he could feel the flowers brushing his ankles. Let's have a look at the flat on Brook Street itself now as a site of domestic Scenius. And one way of looking at it is as a kind of Orientalist decor. So there are Indian fabrics there are Persian rugs on the floor, there's a very garish bedspread, there's ostrich feathers, copper trays, and so on and so forth. What Hendrix did with Kathy, his girlfriend, was to create this kind of otherworldly space where he could write songs, jam with friends, hang out away from the grey city that London largely was then. And this kind of domestic Scenius, this use of design, this collecting of antiques and so on to create a particular kind of space where Hendrix's work with his friends could flourish, signifies the rejection of middle-class norms and aspirational norms. You could see the Eastern influence there as a rejection of the West in some ways, and you have an eclecticism which resists the kind of characterization. Most middle-class homes would have, matching furniture, everything would have its place and so on. You can see this is very, very different from that. And I draw the parallel there, the domestic Scenius, with Jimi Hendrix's music, which of course mixes genres, rejects categorization. Is it blues? Is it rock? Is it jazz? Does it have folk elements? Is it science fiction music? What is this? What is this music? And all of Jimi's friends visited there. Mayer came many times. George Harrison slept over a couple of times. The members of Traffic, including Steve Winwood, came to visit there as well. And the activities there are of a piece with the decor of the room, this sense that, we can remake the world. We can put it together in ways that look quite foreign to convention. Let's look at one last site of Scenius, and this is One Stop Records on South Molton Street. So it's just around the corner from Hendrix's flat on Brook Street. You can get there in about 2 minutes, and I think it's the key site of retail Scenius. One Stop Records was, fortunately for Hendrix, one of the hippest record shops in London, if not the hippest, and the staff prided themselves on getting the latest imports into their window before anyone else. So they would actually drive up to Heathrow Airport to get the boxes, race back to Mayfair and put the sleeves in the window to show customers they were on top of the scene. They had stuff that no one else would have available yet. And Hendrix bought many records from them, particularly American imports, because he was always aware of his competitors. He wanted to know what was going on in the States, and this was the way he was able to do that, because One Stop had such good stock. Their slogan was "Stay one stop ahead," and I think that was absolutely justified. It was a shop with a very, very knowledgeable staff, and it had, one customer said, a fantastic, hushed, rather exclusive atmosphere. One of the reasons I would say this is a site of Scenius is because of the way they encouraged Hendrix to buy quite odd and experimental records. So one of the records that he had at Brook Street was called Le Voyage. It was a classic of musique concrète by Pierre Henry, released in 1968 and based, like John Lennon's song Tomorrow Never Knows, on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. By pushing these really odd records at Hendrix, you had that sense of synergy, I think. They were giving him new ideas to experiment with. So it's a very important site of retail Scenius. My conclusion to all of this is a simple one. Hendrix's music is produced by Scenius, not by genius. I always think his records should have By the Jimi Hendrix Experience with John Pierce, Roger Mayer, Chas Chandler, William Blake, Oscar Wilde and George Harrison and the staff of One Stop Records on the sleeves. I think that would be the most honest account of how this music was produced. Hendrix simply could not have done what he did without the friendly experimental synergy of his scene. And that, I think, is why when he returned to the US in 1969, his work deteriorates badly. He never finds a Scenius group in America which is anything like the one he finds in London. I put on the slide some bullet points which try to crunch how Scenius works, in my opinion. And I'll just highlight a few of those. So Scenius is often created in small private locations away from the norms of business and institutions. So we can think of the Hendrix flat, we can think of One Stop Records and so on. You know, it's hardly a music school. Risk-taking is prestigious in Scenius situations, so you have all those people egging each other on to do stranger and stranger things. And friendly competition or cultural synergy drives efforts, not external kudos. When Hendrix released Purple Haze, there was no guarantee that it was going to be a hit. It's a very, very strange record. New aesthetics, modes and genres are appreciated within the group and not treated with incomprehension or suspicion. So if you remember the deliberate distortion, do not correct on the tape box that was sent to Reprise Records in the US, because Track Records realized that they might not appreciate the sonics of that recording abroad. And Scenius situations are usually fleeting and cannot be institutionalized. This is Hendrix and his friends in flats, in studios, discussing on the street, in nightclubs. It's not, there's no big and lengthy institutionalized thing going on here at all. And it doesn't last long. Ideas and creations develop rapidly because the Scenius group are like-minded and are totally immersed in their interactions. I think that's very, very true. Hendrix's main recordings, his great recordings, are done in less than 2 years, and they're done with, you know, fantastic speed and spirit. And excitement is a propulsive factor. An outrageous, overreaching mentality is foundational. You know, I was thinking that with Roger Mayer. You know, how could, you know, he's doing this in 1967. Surely every sound has been heard by then to human ears. And no, he creates sounds that have never been heard before. And success for one inspires others. I think that's very much true. You know, Hendrix definitely inspires George Harrison and legions of later acolytes, imitators, and so on. Now, my final question is it possible that virtual Scenius can occur? And this is where we come to the notion of creativity in the age of COVID. What can Hendrix teach us about that? I would say several things. Firstly, I think we're more aware than ever that we must collaborate, but that collaboration has to be virtual at this moment because we can't often gather in offices. But the upside of that is we can collaborate with anyone worldwide. There are so many unusual links, I'm sure all of you have already made, to help you with your work and other areas of your life. So I think that notion of collaboration has been strengthened by COVID. I would also say one thing that I've learned is that when you're problem solving, you can look for analogues in other fields for ideas. Talk to people who work in completely different organizations with completely different aims from yours and get ideas that would seem odd at first. But once you're open to them, you can learn stuff because you're breaking your usual patterns of thought. So I was talking to a journalist the other day who always reads poetry before she starts writing journalism, quite obscure poetry as well, because she feels it gets the linguistic part of her brain working. You can think of someone like David Bowie and the massively changing persona he develops as his career goes on as a kind of model for the gig economy where nothing stays forever. You find different collaborators all the time to achieve new things. So that's another kind of Scenius model, I would say. And then I would also say one thing I've learned from working in the age of COVID is that you must take risks to be productive. An experimental mindset is absolutely key, and it's what will let you see good opportunities, new opportunities that we can carry into the post-COVID age. I'll be interested to hear your ideas. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to introduce a special guest who will say a few words to you. It's Dr. Hugh Bolton, who's the Vice Provost and Executive Director of the Bay International Study Centre.
Well, thanks, Christian, for your great talk this afternoon or this evening, depending on where we are in the world. So I'd just like to take the chance to thank all the people who made this possible. This is the first of what I hope will be a series of lectures by members of the BISC faculty, friends, and it does take actually a lot of work to get these things going. So certainly thank you, Nirosha, for being the host this afternoon / evening from your residence in Cambridge. And thank you, Marianne, Kelly, for all the work back in Kingston, and Duncan here in the ballroom at Queen's Castle in England. So wherever you are today, our audience, thank you for taking your afternoon or your evening out to listen to this first of our lecture series. It was a great talk by Christian, and I think that we will have now a chance, I think, to bring Christian back and listen to have any questions that you might have about his work on Jimi Hendrix. Oh.
So I'm going to begin with some questions that were sent in beforehand. If you have questions that have occurred to you during the talk, please ask them in the chat, and I will do my best with that. So the first question we received beforehand was from Liz. What is my favourite Hendrix fun fact? I think his encounters with various famous people are very, very telling. At an early experience rehearsal in London, a man came and knocked on the door and asked them to turn it down a bit, and it was Henry Mancini, the guy who wrote the Pink Panther theme and stuff like that. Another interesting early encounter was, as a kid, Hendrix managed to see Elvis Presley live at Sick's Stadium in Seattle, and Elvis began his act by saying, "I'll begin by playing the American national anthem," and then of course he launches straight into Hound Dog. And I think that may have just given Hendrix the idea that anthems can be many things, and he can do many things with anthems. Of course, at Woodstock, he plays an absolutely remarkable and memorable version of the Star Spangled Banner. Question from Bordown: is it better to attend this lecture sober or no? I'll resort to the formula that Hendrix used to use in interviews when he was dodging questions, and he'd always say not necessarily. From Michelle: how can we help battle online fatigue and online performance fatigue for audiences and as performers? I have a few ideas for that. Firstly, I would say try to recharge your mind and your creativity by looking to other fields and being totally open with collaborators, people you would never normally think of working with, because you can do that today through technology, and that's one way of kind of getting out of your habitual ways of thinking about things. The best performances I've seen during the lockdown here were by performers who actually did something with the situation. So I saw Baxter Jory, who was supposed to be playing at the Royal Albert Hall. He did his concert from his flat in London. I think it's still up on the Royal Albert Hall website. And he starts off by saying, "Welcome to the Albert Hall." "Oh no, it's my flat. And I've got my band with me." "Oh no, I don't. I have my son." So he has his son who's about 15 or something, really bored, and he makes his son play a few chords behind him. So he kind of makes the situation amusing and kind of intimate. I think as audiences, the best thing to do is really to have that experimental, super open-minded attitude towards things. So try getting into the virtual audience for art forms that you would not normally be into. Personally, I absolutely loathe musical theatre, with one exception, which is Oliver by Lionel Barr, which is genius. And I am going to watch Hamilton. I've heard so many interesting things about it. I will force myself to watch that. And maybe I'll change. Maybe the problem is with me not appreciating musical theatre normally. But I'm never going to watch The Lion King under any circumstances. Another question from Christina here. Dylan once said that Hendrix could find things to develop inside a song that others couldn't. Does that level of creativity exist today? So I think what Christina is probably referring to here is Hendrix's covers of Bob Dylan's song. Hendrix was a massive Dylan fan, particularly All Along the Watchtower, his most famous cover. And I would say that level of creativity does exist today, not very usually in rock music, which is kind of a spent force by this stage, I would say. Rock musicians often try to gain interest and traction covering songs when they cover a song from what's a kind of divergent or inappropriate genre. So you get some rock band playing, I don't know, Katy Perry song or something, ironically, and that's about as far as it goes in rockers today. I think much more interesting is if you think of sampling in hip hop and other forms of pop music as well, which in effect are the most honest kind of cover version, because you take elements of an original recording and interpolate them into your own recording. And when people like Kendrick Lamar do that, I think you get a very, very interesting interaction between the person who is the current artist and the past artist, where it can be an assertion of a cultural tradition, it can be a reigniting of the politics of an older song or an older genre of music. It can reactivate, you know, a past subculture that's worthy of attention, or a past artist who has been forgotten as well. So I think there's much more interesting things going on in terms of sampling than the older forms of covers. But there is great creativity around in any musical era, but not necessarily in all genres. I can't see the question. So let's see. Next question from Dawson. Did Hendrix's death amplify the techniques and style he crafted to be used by other popular bands of the time? Yeah, very obviously so. So Hendrix, I would say, much imitated, very, very little understood. So you get plenty of people after Hendrix who use the wah-wah, will use particular kinds of distortion, you know, really screaming guitar sounds, high volume. So all of those things that superficially spell out Hendrix, but without any of the finesse or the way those emerge from and are embedded in the culture and politics of his time. So you end up with loads of people. It's kind of like, you know, Oasis's relationship to the Beatles. You know, frankly, what's the point? It doesn't really do anything new. It has no particular cultural traction. Makes you loads of money, but it's not really very interesting. No one will be listening to that in a few years' time, I don't think. That's one thing. Something else I think is that it's pretty hard to imitate Hendrix, really, because not just his virtuosity, but physically, Hendrix had, you know, really massive hands. He was immensely strong. He had tremendous tone and touch as well. And he was one of the few people who could manipulate feedback to make it do what he wanted to do. Other bands who try to do this will always have like a mark on the stage, and they stand there and get an effect. Hendrix didn't need that. One effect that Hendrix was one of the early pioneers of, along with the Beatles and Pink Floyd, was the use of backwards tapes as well, where you record something forward and then dub it in backwards, so you get quite strange guitar sound in particular. And Hendrix could play it forwards, and it was right. When the Beatles did that, they would have to write it out to play it the right way. They couldn't keep it in their head. So, you know, he had an abnormal musical intelligence, and that's very, very hard for others to copy. What I think his most interesting children, I suppose you could say, are not really in straight blues music, but it's really the experimental mindset. You know, the Beatles would have been, in fact, were at the end of their career, right into synthesizers and so on. And in that sense, it's a real red herring to think about Hendrix as a guitarist. I mean, this is heresy to say this, but Hendrix, a guitar's just a way of getting to where he wants to get. He's not, you know, look at the way he treated his guitars and, you know, gave them away, smashed them up and stuff. He's just, a guitar is just a tool for him. It's not the thing itself. So what Hendrix is trying to do is really create, you know, whole soundscapes and so on. And it's people who have that experimental mentality, I think, are his true inheritors, not sort of necessarily blues guitarists. So, you know, there's some wonderful tributes by Stevie Ray Vaughan. More people like little acts in blues. He uses samples himself, I think. Question from Grant. How the hell are you? I'm fine, thanks, Grant. Nice to hear from you. Grant's a great blues guitarist, actually. Question from Elena. Is this creativity in all fields? Is it global? I wouldn't pretend to know enough about science to answer that question, but I would guess so. You could think of the discovery of DNA, that was definitely a group effort. Crick and Watson got the Nobel Prizes, but of course there's Rosalind Franklin, who created all the data and actually died before the Nobel Prize was awarded. So you could see an obvious Scenius effect there. And I would imagine in many different fields, this is the case. From Matthew, how many artists, musicians, bands do you think exist that are worth being studied to this extent, and how would you try to value that? I think there are many. In any era, there are genres which really are emergent, have power and currency, have an effect beyond entertainment. So you have to try and find, okay, which are the interesting genres, which are the most meaningful genres in any period. And I think to me, it's always music that has an effect on the world. It's political. It really inspires people to act in the world, not just entertainment. There's nothing wrong with just entertainment, but I don't think it has the same importance. My criteria would be, I think, complexity, although complexity is sometimes found in extreme simplicity, relistability, that the music is rich enough to listen to over and over again, a strong effect on the listener. Who today fits these tests? I can talk about Anglo-American music, but there are many other musics in the world, of course, and I wouldn't pronounce on those. Kendrick Lamar is the obvious reigning genius of American music, I would say. David Bowie, a lot of retrospects on him since his death have sort of emphasized Scenius effects there. Prince, obviously again at the absolute top level. I would say a band like Massive Attack, obvious Scenius around them in Bristol, and Tricky, one of their acolytes, who then came into his own. If you don't know who Tricky is, find out. He's a wonderful musician. And then I think there has been some very, very interesting recent work looking at, say, the Scenius surrounding the Rolling Stones. So Wild Jagger Richards are the names that appear on the copyright to the songs. They're very much styled by Anita Pallenberg, who was Brian Jones's girlfriend and then Keith Richards' girlfriend. And then, of course, Andrew Oldham, their first manager, was an absolute genius of promotion and creating an image and getting their politics across. So, yeah, there is plenty to look at now. You just have to sift it a bit because, of course, you can now hear everything. Some questions which we've just got in. So from Jennifer, you talk about like-mindedness as a condition for Scenius, but what about how different experiences and backgrounds actually expand thinking and ideas within the group? Very, very good point. I think there has to be a common goal or area of interest within the Scenius group, but the more divergent people you get within that group, the better, because you will have more angles, more background experiences, and it's all about having an experimental mentality and being willing to listen to each other, I would say, and respect each other's ideas. Do you think it's possible to create a Scenius environment on your own terms? How important is it for a Scenius to come together spontaneously? A very, very good and difficult question to answer, I would say. I can think of Scenius comes about rarely. You know it when you see it. It's kind of hard to generate, I would say. I think it genuinely is spontaneous as far as anything is spontaneous in the world. But you're lucky if you ever get involved in it. I don't think I've ever been involved in a Scenius situation. But as I suggested in my comments on the last slide, there are elements of Scenius that you can bring into your own practice. Some of the things that occur within Scenius groups you can learn from, even if you're not within a Scenius group yourself. Okay, last question from Les. Grant on my question, good to see and hear you. Thank you, Les, it's nice to hear from you as well. I'm afraid we've run out of time there, so I will turn it over to Narosha. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd, for that engaging and thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure I can speak for many of the alumni in the audience when I say it was wonderful to be able to re-immerse myself in the life of a BISC student, even if only virtually, for this brief time. I would also like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. We're interested in hearing your thoughts on this mini lecture, and so after the session, you'll be asked to participate in a short survey. I hope you'll take a couple of minutes to fill it out and share your feedback with us. You will also receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording from today's session, so please watch out for that. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you again for staying connected with the Bader International Study Center and encourage you to watch for updates on future mini lectures featuring more of our favorite professors and other ways to connect with your CASEL community through the CASEL Herald, e-newsletter, BISC Facebook page, and BISC Alumni LinkedIn group. Thank you.